afternoon. So sorry, I feel a bit like in a rock concert when people are waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally someone comes in. Sorry for the mishap. So look, very nice to meet you all. I'm here to talk to you in English about the future of privacy, its impact on Latin America, and on advertising technology. So I'm Vincent Potier. I'm the CEO of Clever. Clever is a trading desk operating in North America, and we also operate in the Americas, in Latin America. And I'm also working through another company of mine with my friends at Retargetly as the data protection officer for basically at a global level. So let's start. So the world of privacy. Hopefully the technology of the balloon works. So here we go. We are now in the sky, and we've got 30 minutes to talk about privacy and ad tech. So we need to hurry up. So let's jump. Okay. So I will start, and obviously, hopefully you can see me and hear me, but I can't see you. I will start with a question. Does anyone know what happened on January 14, 2020? And as it says on the slide, there is a gift at the end if you get it right. Okay, so I will wait a bit and give you the option to actually use the chat tool, and then we'll see. So anyone knows? No? Okay. So obviously, I'm sure you guessed it. It was the Chrome announcement. So the Chrome announcement is obviously no news because it's been in the making for a very long time. For those who've been in this industry for a while, like me, people have been talking about the demise of cookies for as long as there has been a programmatic industry. But we only starting to see the effects of what's going to happen. And what people forget is it's not, the industry which doesn't like the cookies. It's not, Chrome or Google who has decided to dominate the world. It has a lot to do with privacy. GDPR is the source, is the origin of everything. So please do connect the Chrome announcement and what's happened on the 25th of May, 2018, when GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, was enforced and basically was implemented in Europe. Because the GDPR has changed absolutely everything. Since the GDPR was implemented back in May 2018, so many countries have changed their privacy rules. So Japan has made updates, Australia is about to make updates, India is about to do that, Thailand has passed the PDPA, which is a GDPR-inspired data protection legislation. Singapore has changed their data protection law. And obviously, the United States, although they have not made any amendment to any federal privacy law or act, they have passed state laws. The most famous of all being the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. But California is not the only state in the United States which has changed its data protection legislation and which has passed an all-encompassing data protection law. Nevada has made a big update, Colorado has made an update, Vermont has made an update, and the second state which has actually implemented, which is about to implement in 2023, a all-encompassing data protection legislation is Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia here. So there is a lot of talk between now and November 2022 of a US Federal Privacy Act, which would basically try to harmonize the different progressive state laws, like the one in California and the one in Virginia, in order to have, a workable legislative environment in the United States from a data protection law. And what I'm going to talk about, of course, is what has happened in Latin America. a lot of things have been changing from a data protection legislation in Latin America. So before we go into that, remember, the GDPR changes everything, okay? With the GDPR, basically you've got a very clear definition of personal data. There is no more of, PII, which is names and addresses, etc., and then anonymous cookies. That doesn't exist anymore with the GDPR. And we'll talk about that again, but the GDPR defines personal data in such a broad way that suddenly, overnight, what is the currency of the industry? Cookies, device IDs, IP addresses, but mostly third-party cookies, of course, they suddenly fell into the definition of personal data. So the notion of anonymous cookie, which is the way it was talked about in the industry back, 3-4 years ago, that has become totally irrelevant. In order to collect and process and transfer personal data, you need a legal base. So there are 6 legal bases under the GDPR. You will see with other legislations which are inspired from the GDPR, there is more than that. But you cannot collect cookies or device IDs or IP addresses or anything PII without a legal base. And the most common legal base in Europe, and again, you'll see it in other data protection legislations, is consent, consentimiento, or legitimate interests. Then the other big innovation is data subjects or consumers or users of any one site have totally the right to write to you, to anyone, and just say, do you have my data? If you have my data, can you please delete it? If you have my data, can you please show to me what you have? You have my data, can you please port it to your nearest competitor? All these rights are now enshrined in the GDPR. In addition, there are also data protection principles. So the data protection principles, there are 7 under the GDPR, more under other legislations. They are basically supposed to structure the framework of what people can do and cannot do under the data protection law. So it can be examples of data protection principles are storage limitation. For example, you cannot store data on your servers indefinitely. You need a limitation. You need to say to the consumer, I'm collecting your data, I'm storing it, I'm processing it, but I'm doing it for 2 months or 6 months or 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. Contracts, we've all been signing contracts for a while, but the GDPR has invented what is called data processing addenda or data processing agreements, which are addenda to the MSAs, to the existing contracts, and which deal specifically with the obligations of the controller or the processor under GDPR. Then security standards have become absolutely essential. There is more and more of a drive to make sure that even if you work in the ad tech industry, you are actually hacker-proof. I can tell you that in Europe, a lot of fines have been passed on companies which have been breached, which have been attacked by hackers. So you might say, oh, what is a hacker going to do with email addresses or with cookie IDs? Actually, not a lot, but the regulator really doesn't like it. If it happens, if basically a company gets hacked now in the new world, you can get into an investigation which will last about 2 or 3 years. That's the way things are playing in Europe. And why do I talk about Europe in a subject which is about Latin America? Is because the prediction is it's going to be like that everywhere in the world because it's already started, okay? And I believe that Latin America has actually been the most influenced by GDPR in the world. And we're going to talk about why, okay? as you know, there are many legislations which basically have been implemented either recently or not, with recent updates. So in Mexico, you've got, I'm not going to mention them all, but you've got the Ley General de Protección de Datos Personales en Posesión de Sujetos Obligados. Then you've got legislation in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru. And obviously, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a second, in Brazil too, which is really important. So next, again, it would be great with a bit more interaction, but something that maybe you know, but quite a few people don't know, is that all Latin American companies are, in a way, under the GDPR. And that is, so you've got Latin American companies under the GDPR, and then you also have to deal with the data protection legislation of the country where you operate and the countries where you're going to operate within Latin America. And why is that? Why are any Latin American companies under the GDPR? That is very important to understand, because the internet is very much language-based, okay? If I live in Spain and I'm a Spanish speaker, I will go to sites which are Spanish speaking and which are not in Spain. So it's going to be, could be US sites, but it's very likely it's going to be Mexican sites, Argentine sites, Chilean sites. As soon as a resident of the European Union visits a site which is in Chile, in Argentina, in Mexico, anywhere, the publisher or the owner of the website is supposedly under the GDPR, okay? And it's the same thing when you've got a data subject from Portugal who visits a site in Brazil, exactly the same story. Now, another point I want to emphasize is the level of compliance with, or the level of similarity with what's going on in Europe is actually varies a lot in Latin America. So what you may or may not know is actually 2 countries in Latin America already have what is called an adequacy agreement. These are Argentina and Uruguay. So the European Union has deemed that Argentina and Uruguay have basically legal frameworks which guarantee enough protection to data. What does it mean? It means it makes transferring data from Europe to Argentina and Uruguay much easier. Then you've got Brazil, which, because of the LGPD, which we are going to talk about in a second, has made big strides towards really matching the new standards which have been set by the GDPR. Is actually actively seeking an adequacy decision, so an agreement between Europe and the country in order to facilitate transfers of data from the EU to Brazil. Okay. Still, there are remaining challenges. In most countries, you don't have one data protection act. You've got basically a complex legislative patchwork, and that makes it complicated. Then you've got the data culture of the private and the public sectors, which is not always there, okay? So legislation is one thing, but what you need, obviously, is a culture. Now, what's going on is the legislation very often can influence the culture, and that's really, really important. Then you've got data security standards, which are going to be absolutely essential. As you know, I'm sure everyone's reading the news. In the past 4 or 5 months, with the new administration in the United States, cyber attacks have been really the big talk of the town. Trust me, this year, next year, the year after, everyone will be talking about cybersecurity. And of course, if you're a bank, if you're a major retailer, or if you're a hospital, cybersecurity should be at the absolute top of the agenda of the business. Of course, when you deal with cookie IDs or device IDs, it may not seem as important, but it's going to be very, very important. Now, let's talk about LGPD. So Brazil is the only country which has adopted a legislation actually quite similar to the GDPR. It's called the LGPD, or Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados Pessoais. It was voted in August 2018, and it was implemented after 4 delays on the 18th of September 2020. And what it's done, it's replaced or supplemented more than 40 legal norms dealing with privacy and data protection. The aim is to make the country more competitive in an increasingly data-driven world economy. And what's been going on, and we'll talk about that, is that the industry has been waiting for the widely anticipated guidance from the ANPD, which is the Agência Nacional de Proteção de Dados. Now, if you look into the LGPD, it's actually very similar to the GDPR. It's basically a shorter version. It's 30, 40 pages long. GDPR is about 100 plus pages long, very, very detailed. The definition of personal data is exactly the same. There are 10 legal bases, 10 data protection principles, personal sensitive data, which is any data revealing ethnicity, religion, philosophical beliefs, health, sex orientation, etc., is defined there. There are numerous data subject rights. Also, the notion of what a controller is and a processor, which is a very important notion, are well defined. So a controller is basically the company which sets the means and the purposes. So los medios y las finalidades of the processing. Okay. Then the notion of international transfers is not as detailed. The notion of data breaches, which again we're back into cybersecurity, is also very important. The data protection officer, who is, or the encargado in the law in Brazil, is actually the party who's supposed to be the interface between the company or the controller and the regulator or the data subjects or the consumers. The penalties are quite important, and the data protection authority has been established. As I said earlier, it's called the Agência Nacional de Proteção de Dados, and it's being staffed. There is a lot of conversations in the Brazilian industry, the digital industry, with the ANPD in order to make quite a few decisions on especially what is called the guidance. So you've got the data protection legislation, but then how is it going to be exactly implemented? And that's where the regulator, is supposed to issue guidance. Now, something which may be interesting for you is what are the learnings we feel after 9 months of LGPD implementation? So the first learning, it's not moving very fast, okay? But if we compare with what happened in Europe, it was not moving very fast in Europe either. So that's the nature of, at least legislative changes, especially when they're as massive as they are. It doesn't, always go at the speed we used to in our businesses. The biggest change I've seen is really in terms of contractual relations. So the big companies have been talking to each other and to smaller companies and have really changed the way they negotiate their contracts. So the notion of DPA, data processing agreement, has become really, really important. And it's been the biggest topic, determined by the LGPD, has been really the contractual relationships. The industry, so the digital industry, is still very uncertain about which legal base to go for. Consent, legitimate interests, consent or legitimate interests is very unclear. As I say, the ANPD is still being formed. There is no guidance yet. The courts, the Brazilian courts, have been quite active. They've basically, done all kinds of things with data companies. There is, based on my own experience, still very limited data subject request activity, meaning, if you work in Europe, you get emails from data subjects on a regular basis saying, hey, can you please delete my data? Can you please tell me what my data is? I want to know. And same thing in California. In Brazil, I haven't seen anything like this. The behavior is what I call by bursts, meaning if you look at it, it's like every single time there is an article in the press which talks about whatever someone has said, or a fine which has been put on someone, suddenly you've got a lot of activity and a lot of people try to change things, and there is a lot of tension, and then it goes down again. And the last thing I would say is we've seen a very, very diverse interpretation of LGPD by companies. The big companies go overboard, they're extremely careful, and the small companies haven't really looked very involved. But that's very normal. And you know what? It's going to change because everyone will have to comply. Now, back to a more AdTech topic. The obvious casualty, as I was saying in my introduction, of the GDPR, and remember, why do I talk about GDPR in a Latin American context? Because same as US DSPs are the gold standard of programmatic back 10 years ago, and they still are, GDPR is the gold standard of data privacy in the world, okay? And every single nation will look into the GDPR before they pass their data protection legislation. And at Retargetly, by the way, we started with GDPR compliance even before the LGPD was passed, CCPA was passed, etc. That's why it was much easier to then comply with LGPD, comply with GDPR, and comply with all the emerging new data protection legislations. So back to the cookie. The cookie's gone. We know that. We've been talking about that in the previous session, so I'm not going to repeat it. And it's really the third-party cookie which is gone, as you well know, which obviously has an impact on nearly everything we know. Frequency capping, retargeting, measurement, multi-touch attribution, all these things will become extremely hard to do as we used to do them. And the reason the cookie's gone, as I said in my intro, it's not because Chrome one day, woke up and decided, hey, you know what, I've had enough. It's simply, again, because of the GDPR. The Chrome announcement really came exactly 1 year after the biggest fine that Europe has ever put on Google. And this big fine actually was put in great part because of data privacy and the GDPR. So I explained the difference between, what personal data definition has done to the cookie. It used to be anonymous. It was the currency of the business. Suddenly, 3 years ago, it becomes personal data. The pressure is untenable. And this is what happens. Chrome, Apple, Facebook, everyone has basically to comply. Now, what are the key impacts? Contrary to what people say, I hear a lot of people say that actually the duopoly, so Google and Facebook, or you could argue Google, Facebook, and Apple and Amazon, but that's not a duopoly anymore, are going to benefit. But actually, it's the opposite. Advertisers are never going to be content just putting their money with Google and Facebook. And as you know, these two giant companies are under a lot of pressure, both in Europe and the United States. So they will be very careful not to actually augment their market share of the programmatic space. So then you will have, it will put a lot of pressure on industry frameworks. For example, the TCF, which is the Transparency and Consent Framework in Europe, which is very cookie-based. How is it going to evolve? This is also something that people are thinking about in Brazil in terms of compliance with the LGPD. Privacy policies are changing. They will keep on changing. Let's never forget the importance of doing a good privacy policy in order to comply with the new legislation. Contract work will be huge. Legal departments are going to be happy. And then obviously security standards, there is more and more interest and pressure to actually comply with ISO 27001 at a minimum. And the indirect impact, I mean, we know about Chrome, we know about iOS 14. As you know, in the United States, only 4% of the iOS 14 device owners have actually opted in. So that means 96%. Suddenly overnight, you know, a big part of the Facebook spend just disappeared. We spoke about the end of third-party cookies. By the way, I don't believe that the end of third-party cookies is going to happen overnight. I think it will be a much more progressive process than what people say. There will be a rise of clean rooms. So basically DMPs, but which are super safe, super secure DMPs. Again, if we had more time, I could talk to you about that. The rise of tokenization, the rise of single sign-on, all these things are going to happen. The most likely outcome, so what would be the predictions in the Latin American environment? I think CTV, which is the fastest growing channel in the United States for the last 2 years in programmatic, which is obviously connected TV, is going to grow really fast. Remember, CTV is not dependent on cookies. Video is also going to grow a lot. DOH, which is outdoor or out of home, which is digital, has started to grow really fast in the United States too. I think performance budgets are going to change. There will be a lot of first-party cookie-based strategies, which obviously doesn't allow the same scale than with third-party cookies. There could be actually quite a fair bit of migration from performance budgets to brand budgets in the programmatic ad space. At the beginning, authenticated audiences are going to disappoint. There will be a problem of scale. There will be a problem of matching. There will be obviously a big opportunity for contextual to reinvent itself and also for native. But I don't believe at all that the new programmatic world will be mostly contextual based. It won't. Contextual will be just a part of it. There will be code-based advertising, which is going to emerge. You know, for 20 years, you know, for 100 years prior to the beginning of digital, people and advertisers were very happy to spend on segments without any knowledge whether, you know, which users they were targeting. They were just targeting audiences. So there was a probabilistic nature naturally in the targeting. And I believe it's going to come back, but in a certain way, because we went from very broad audience when digital started 20 years ago to user level targeting. And I believe there will be the emergence of mini segment targeting, where you actually target very small and very narrow groups. And we don't know, maybe that kind of targeting could actually work and deliver very good performance. I think non-digital operators, which own very interesting data sets, such as telcos or retailers, will get very, very involved in digital advertising, because it will be a big opportunity to actually find new sources of revenue. Universal IDs at the beginning, as I say, might struggle a bit, but then there will be a place for universal IDs. I have no doubt about that. And I also believe that a lot of the tracking that we will do, a lot of the targeting we will do, will become more probabilistic and less deterministic. So what are the future developments? There will be a US federal law. I have no doubt about that. I just don't know whether it's going to happen before 2022 or after. There will be a pressure on adequacy. As you know, if you look at the context of why LGPD was passed in Brazil and implemented, it has a lot to do with Brazil wanting to really make sure that they are compliant and they have a chance and a fight in an increasingly data-driven global economy. And this is, this is obviously the size of the European market is having a lot of influence on that. Because when you've got an adequacy decision, I explained what it was earlier, it basically means that the European Union deems the country to be okay for transferring data. And if you don't have an adequacy decision, it makes data transfers between Europe and those countries without an adequacy decision much more complicated. Again, I'm very happy to talk about that in detail, if anyone is interested later. There will be a generalization of data protection legislation. Then there will be an emergence of data best practice. There will be a focus on security standards. Then there will be the rise of privacy tech providers also, okay? Now, what should you do quickly, okay? The first thing, even if it's not written here, is don't panic, okay? There will not be a cookie Armageddon. Things are not going to change like tomorrow or overnight or 1st of January 2022, when, if you remember, Google and Chrome was very, very careful not to announce a specific date for the deprecation of third-party cookies, which means that they will do it step by step throughout the year 2022. So the other thing is we have to accept it, because there won't be a replacement to the cookie. It's gone, it's over. From the ashes of the third-party cookie demise, you will see basically many other options, many other ways of running digital advertising. It will just be different, okay? And the industry, let's not underestimate it, is at the verge of its biggest change since the invention of DSPs and since the invention of the 10 years ago and the invention of the cookie 20 years ago. Of course, you need to look for alternatives to third-party cookies, but as I say, there will not be one currency, which was very imperfect, by the way. There will be many, many different currencies. We need to develop a data culture and data best practices. Even with cookies going away, data will be even more sophisticated and interesting than before in the third-party cookie world. And simply, as always, when you've got a major change in an industry, let's treat it as an opportunity to pull ahead of the competition. And that's it for me. Please let me know if you have questions. Would be very happy to answer them.
Volvemos del estudio para dar cierre a lo que fue nuestro primer evento. Gracias, Vincent, por tu consejo de cómo navegar el landscape regulatorio. Ojalá que les haya servido a muchos de ustedes que siguen conectados. Antes de cerrar, quiero agradecerles a nuestros speakers, a todos aquellos invitados que lograron hacer hueco en sus agendas para acompañarnos hoy y darnos su perspectiva. La verdad que súper enriquecedora la perspectiva de todos los miembros que participaron del evento de hoy. Agradecerle también a nuestro equipo que hizo posible este evento en transmisión en vivo en más de 6 países al mismo tiempo, coordinando con miembros de países de distintos lugares. Muchas gracias, sabemos que requirió mucho esfuerzo, obviamente con algunos desperfectos técnicos, pero con mucho aprendizaje para un próximo evento mucho mejor. Para cerrar, ojalá se hayan llevado una buena impresión, ojalá hayan enriquecido su perspectiva respecto a ecosistemas de datos, respecto a lo que depara el futuro cookies, y con alguna y otra idea de qué acciones pueden tomar, tanto sean como marcas, como compañías de tecnología o medios, de cómo navegar aquello que viene. Nuestra visión, como habíamos dicho, es generar un ecosistema de datos abierto, seguro y robusto. Y nos parece que parte de eso es escuchar muchísimas voces y poder enriquecer de distintas perspectivas. Así que muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Les estaremos enviando más material relacionado a la temática y algunos highlights del evento. Gracias.